like to introduce you to our next speaker, His Excellency, Minister of Defense of Finland, Haglund. We are on a very tight timeline. I believe you have to fly back to Finland right after this. So I will keep my initial remarks short and I will give you the floor soonish. Mr. Haglund was appointed as the Minister of Defense in 2012, so 2 years ago in the summer. He's also the leader of Swedish People's Party in Finland. And prior to being appointed as Minister of Defense, he served as a member of the European Parliament in Brussels. Mr. Haglund took office at a challenging time when the government had just recently decided on an extensive defense forces reform in Finland. But from these internal challenges, we of course know the changing security environment that has put its own or created its own challenges in the past year or so. Mr. Haglund has been active and successful in promoting defense cooperation in various international contexts during these 2 years. At the Nordic level, together with Baltic states as well, to some extent, within the EU of course, and at NATO, most recently now. Finland of course is one of the most active partner nations of NATO. It has contributed extensively to NATO operations and to the development of partnerships. And I hope that we will now hear more about that aspect of NATO. And without further ado, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to be here. Greetings from the summit where we just wrapped up. On our side, the meeting, I believe the member states of the alliance are still having some final meetings. It's been 2 very interesting and I would say fruitful and also quite good days with good results. Mainly around, of course, the discussions around the very difficult situation in Ukraine, but also good meetings and forward-looking meetings on the situation in Afghanistan. And from our point of view, the maybe most important meeting was the meeting concerning partnerships, and especially the one we had today on enhanced partnerships, where 5 partner nations were chosen and picked to discuss with the member countries in the alliance their future partnership. For Finland, this is a great achievement because we have for a longer time trying to promote our own partnership within NATO in order to sustain the level of cooperation we have achieved over the years. Finland has been an active partner of NATO since 1994, so 20 years now. And from that point of view, it's very positive that NATO this summit was able to adopt this new partnership initiative that also includes this group of enhanced partners where Finland is included. Looking back at what we have done over the past 20 years, it was good to hear how mutually we felt that this brings along a huge added value both to member states within the alliance and also then to the partner countries. It was very good to hear also that there was a strong feeling amongst the alliance and the allies to further develop this partnership, including political dialogue with the member countries, which is important because of the fact that all the decisions NATO takes and all the measures NATO decides to take has a clear influence on both globally and especially in Europe. And hence it's important for us to keep up the good dialogue with NATO that primarily has been handled over the past decade or so through the regular meetings around the ISAF operation in Afghanistan, where Finland has been one of the contributing nations. And in the light of the fact that the ISAF mission or operation is coming to an end, this new partnership initiative, including this political dialogue, is an achievement for us, and we have also over the past year and 2 tried to achieve this through an initiative made by Sweden and us, and that was very well reflected now in the new partnership initiative that the alliance has adopted, so it's been a very positive day from our point of view today. I'm also very pleased to say that the Afghanistan meeting yesterday was good. The fact of the matter is that the situation in Afghanistan is still very fragile. We have seen a very positive development with a big part of the population now having access to healthcare, girls and women going to school and getting education, etc., etc. roads being built, infrastructure being built, economy growing actually quite rapidly, even though it's still on a fairly low level, but in general very positive development, and we are pleased to see that, but at the same time well aware of the fact that that the work in Afghanistan is far from ready and over, and we still need to do a lot to support the Afghan development. And looking at what's happening in Iraq right now, Syria, with the terrible terrorist organization Islamic State is spreading all the time, we see a very scary example of what can happen if something is left too early, and I think that we do have to learn from what's happening in Iraq, and that's a clear proof of why we have to follow up and follow through the work in Afghanistan, and why this mission resolute support that we're about to start is of such vital importance. And that's why I'm very pleased and happy to say that we had a good meeting on Afghanistan yesterday, where also Finland is committed to contribute to the mission resolute support, and we also had a clear message from the both presidential candidates in Afghanistan that they're both committed in signing the bilateral security agreement with the Americans, and hence enabling the so-called SOFA, that is the prerequisite for the mission resolute support, to start at the beginning of next year. So overall, I'd say it's been 2 very good days. The alliance have then amongst themselves discussed mainly the situation in Ukraine, and that's something that is of interest for us too. Allow me to remind you that Finland has a 1,300-kilometer long border with Russia. So we have some experience of our eastern neighbor, and also some negative experience over the years, but also has to be said positive experience over the past 20 years, where we have had a positive economic integration, and also maybe unfortunately have underestimated some things and also focused on the positive developments, and it's very sad to say that we now have seen that Russia unfortunately is not a democracy, and Russia will not become what we had hoped it would become or was becoming, and it requires firm action. The alliance has taken firm action. The European Union, and Finland is a very engaged member, has taken firm action, and will need more firm action. Positive, a matter of fact where I will also wrap up, is of course the really recent developments in Ukraine, where we have seen some serious strivings to achieve some sort of ceasefire solution. This ceasefire solution is far from ready, and we have had reports that they're still fighting, but already the fact that we're discussing a ceasefire solution is a positive step in the right direction, and that's also something that's good to note, and it's something which has of course dominated the whole summit and will dominate the defense and security policy very much in Europe and probably globally over the years to come, and have also an influence on both discussion and measures that we'll take in Finland and most likely in the rest of Europe and also globally. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and discuss with you, and I'm very happy to answer any possible questions.
Thank you. We are all very happy to hear your initial thoughts from the meeting. We've all been relying on mainly on Twitter for information from the summit. We've been pretty occupied with our own one here. I'll just begin by asking a question myself. We had the Georgian Minister of Defense, Irakli Alasania, speaking to us yesterday, and as you know, Georgia is one of the partner countries who are also in this enhanced partner agreement, or has that agreement with NATO. And he was talking about being proud of receiving a NATO gold card, which is a terminology that I think was referred to in some of the at least Swedish media as well. And that for Georgia, this will mean that they will see more NATO on the ground. I believe that the whole idea of the partnership arrangement is that each partner will have a very different kind of arrangement with NATO, and that the practical implications will be different. What do you expect them to be for Finland?
Well, first of all, I'm personally not all that convinced that we should call this a gold card. But dear colleague Alsani, who I met this morning, we discussed this bilaterally in a meeting. He can call it a gold card, and I'm happy that they perceive it that way. From a Finnish point of view, it's not a gold card because then we've had it for a longer time. Because this doesn't bring that much new. It's more about actually putting on paper the level of very good cooperation we have had with NATO over the past 20 years, which has been built up over the years to the level where we are today. And actually, when we look at what will change, not that much will change. The changing factors are rather the factors which come from the fact that we have the crisis in Ukraine. The only, I would say, big new element is this promise of political dialogue, which I referred to before, which also has existed to a certain extent through the ISAF format and meetings we have had around ISAF. But that's the big new thing. But of course, in Georgia, they have maybe not have the same history as we have had. So from their point of view, I understand that it's a bigger achievement, and they are also very much keen on being able to join NATO in the near future. So I'm sure that this also very well serves their internal discussion and debate, where the politicians are keen on of course, showing that they're taking positive steps towards NATO, and that's I think a very good thing, and I'm happy about the aspirations of the Georgians to join NATO. I think it's a very good thing. But from our point of view, we don't perceive this as receiving a gold card. We are more seeing it as preserving what we have right now.
Thank you. Let me just take some questions. Yes, over there.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Minister. Well, now that you, as you said, formalized the already very close cooperation you have with NATO, and as a Norwegian, I can only be happy that you go down this road. I would just like to ask, is it now on the agenda to take the final step?
Well, that's the only decisive step, what I just explained to a few journalists, that when it boils down to it, either you're a member or you're not. And I think that what's happening in Ukraine right now, where they have been fairly desperate to get support, also military support, in order to survive the attacks from the separatists supported by the Russian army, they have been left more or less alone. And that's because they're not a member of the alliance. That same goes for Finland. If we would in theory end up in a crisis, we still plan for having to handle the crisis by ourselves. And that is the difference between being a member and not being a member, and that's why a gold card doesn't make you too happy. In that, when you look at the real hardcore of NATO, and Article 5 is the core of NATO, and the partnership agenda and initiative doesn't at all touch upon the actual hardcore. For Finland, we're having a very, I would say, active debate on NATO in general, and have had that now for a longer time. The crisis in Ukraine has intensified the debate. Necessarily, it hasn't made it far better. It's been quite, I would say, difficult debate because there's a lot of feelings involved. It's not very rational, and people have very clear views, and they're not very keen, nor people don't tend to listen to each other's arguments that well in our domestic NATO debate. But we're heading towards an election in April next year, and it's very evident that NATO and a possible NATO membership for Finland will become one of the themes discussed in the campaign. I don't, unfortunately, I must say, because I'm one of those who is in favor of a Finnish membership in NATO. Unfortunately, I don't believe that there will be a big change in the spring. The biggest factors that could bring along a change would probably be either the crisis in Ukraine still becoming more severe and worse, or then perhaps our neighboring country Sweden doing something which we don't believe will happen, but if it would happen, it would probably have an influence on us.
Thank you. I think that was the question everyone wanted to ask. So now we can take a few questions at the same time. Yes, please.
Henry Collis from the UK. I just have a question about how, well, you mentioned your experience of your neighbours to the east, and I wonder how much competition in the Arctic conditions your policy towards Russia, how that fits into your wider strategic context, and now sort of looking into the wider sort of NATO context, whether there are sort of strategic reasons that you can see for
Well, the Arctic is both challenging and important area where a lot of countries, for understandable reasons, have quite big interests. And we know that the development of the Arctic, mainly the climate change, bringing about new possibilities. At the same time, we have a very vulnerable environment there that should be respected. And Finland is one of the founding and very active members of the Arctic Council, and we will continue to be one. And in the Arctic Council, there has been a fairly broad understanding amongst the founding members around the way the Arctic should be approached and handled. And this sort of competition around the natural resources there could be very, very harmful. And also then with the growing economic interests through natural resources, we could also see a militarization of the Arctic, which I personally don't view as a positive development at all, on the contrary. And hence, we are very keen in Finland that the Arctic Council stays as an important player and also tries to keep Russia on board, because if we have this Cold War competition set up with Russia and the Western community, whatever you want to call it, EU, NATO sphere, sort of competing about the resources in the Arctic with some help of the Chinese and the Japanese, it's not going to be a very positive development for anyone, and the least for the environment. And therefore, I would say that it's important to not make the Arctic a playground for this unfortunately new, I wouldn't call it a Cold War yet, but in the worst case, some sort of Cold War II emerging, and we should try to avoid the Arctic as a playground for that if that will emerge.
Let's take the two questions here in the front.
Can I just build on the I just want to build on the previous question and go back to Russia for a minute. I really am interested in your view, and how do you think relations with Russia are going to look like in the next years? Or is Finland planning on changing its policy towards Russia in any way?
Perhaps I can build upon a little bit. My name is Nicholas Katsibras from Greece. When you have escalation in tension, and I think it's most of us want to de-escalate the conflict, the role of narratives is critical. And in this point of view, there can be entry points that can help and from the past to educate those entry points to go forward to de-escalate the situation. And you mentioned before in the beginning of your introduction how the 20 years you actually had also some good aspects of your cooperation with Russia. Do you think that there can be some points there that you can build upon to first of all mitigate your concerns and then take it from there a step further?
Well, first of all, it's good to say that Finland, despite of many factors, but also thanks to many factors, has a very good relationship to Russia. We're probably globally one of those who still has the best relation to Russia, despite of the fact, going first to your question about our relationship to Russia, the fact of the matter is that the Finnish government has never formally probably been so critical towards Russia as we have been over the past 6 months, and we have very strongly, clearly condemned their actions on the Crimea and later on in eastern Ukraine. And this is quite historical from a Finnish point of view, where we unfortunately, after the Second World War, up till the end of the Cold War, we're in a situation where we were in this whatever neutral zone between the Russian or Soviet sphere of interest and the Western sphere of interest, and we had to sort of balance between the two for a long time, and that also meant that we wouldn't and couldn't never have been critical to Russia during the Cold War. And now, because of that, it's of course affected our relationship to Russia, but still our president has a very good bilateral discussion and dialogue with his colleague, President Putin, despite of the criticism we have given them, etc. And we still have, of course, quite active business contacts over the border, which is natural for two neighbors with a lot of economic activities, and that also goes to your question, where we have over the past, since the Soviet collapsed, we have seen very positive development again now, especially in later years, where our economies have emerged or worked a lot together. We have seen a lot of Finnish companies working in Russia and the other way around. We have a huge amount of people traveling over our border, and this has been a very, I would say, good trend with people getting to know people, business working with quite normal circumstances, and this was this positive development that sort of came to a very abrupt point in time when this Ukraine crisis started, and as a huge disappointment. We probably should have understood that the alarm clocks were ringing already back when the crisis was in Georgia, but somehow it was sort of wiped under the carpet, and people sort of put it aside and figured that that was just this one-time thing, and it didn't actually affect too much anyone's policies. It goes for Finland, but goes also for other EU countries and also for the United States, etc. It didn't too much affect our Russia policy. And now looking back at what happened then, and also looking back at the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, etc. Now when we have some perspective of what's happened, I guess we could learn a lot from the mistakes we've done, where we have partially underestimated Russia, but also maybe disrespected them to a certain extent, but also maybe not understood the way they are. And we had this, I would say, illusion that they were developing towards a Western democracy. Now we have to be honest and say that they are not a democracy, and they're not a Western democracy, and Putin even said himself that they don't want to become a Western democracy. And when that's the case, we have to take that into account in our future policies. So of course we can't just continue as before, and we have also are part of these sanctions against the Russians, and that has, through the European Union, that has had a strong economic negative impact on our economy, and that's not very popular at home, but still it's necessary. And we also know that despite all of this policy of sanctions does have a fairly strong support amongst the ordinary Finnish people.
If I may see it from a different perspective, do you think that maybe there could be an opportunity to actually use your unique position in the background to actually help communicate this, like filling the communication gap?
Well, we have tried. I mean, I don't know how many of you noted that our president just a few weeks ago had first bilateral with Putin and then with Poroshenko, and we are available, but we're not going to sort of push ourselves in there and get involved if it's, but on demand, yes. Of course, our president has said that probably also other politicians are willing to help if we can mitigate some sort of peaceful solution to this tragical situation we are in. But that's mainly on an international demand, or demand by the parties involved in this crisis. We have tried, and we will of course continue to try, but mainly we're working through the European Union. But it's clear that especially our president has been very active, and also given his knowledge and expertise to European Union leaders, and also discussed with Washington, discussed with Moscow, Berlin, Paris, etc. So especially he's been very active, I would say, in a very positive way, trying to facilitate some sort of peaceful solution.
Picking up on that, since you mentioned the European Union, there will be an informal EU defense ministers meeting next week. Ukraine, of course, is a topic for the EU as well, but looking more broadly on the topics that have been discussed in this summit, what do you think will be the messages that will be taken to that meeting from the NATO summit now?
Well, it's clear that Ukraine will dominate, but then we're also going to look at, we had a EU council, European Council, with the heads of state gathering for the first time in history around defense policy last year in December, only 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and actually time flies, it's more than that already, but anyway, 9-10 months ago, and it was a historical meeting that was before the crisis in Ukraine. In my view, the heads of state took more ambitious decisions than I had expected, and we are now on a defense minister level following up on those decisions, and that's one of our main tasks right now, and that will also be one of the important themes at the meeting. But of course, the Ukraine crisis has a strong spillover on our meetings. It also has a spillover on the level of ambition to actually implement the decisions made by the European Council in December, where partially it has a positive effect where countries see that we need to work more tightly together, but at the same time, honestly speaking, we can see that the NATO countries, the alliances, to a certain extent focusing on their common activities, and the EU activities are not of the greatest importance right now for the alliance, which I can of course fully understand. And because of that, it's going to be very interesting actually to see what the discussion will bring along next Tuesday, Wednesday in Milano. On top of that, we are discussing the operations. EU is quite actively involved now in crisis management, mainly in Africa, where we have operations in Mali, in Central African Republic, in Somalia, etc. Finland is actually taking part in all of the three mentioned ones, so we are actively involved also there and have interests there because of that.
One more question from Norway there. Again.
Hi, I'm Marta from Norway. I just want to ask you, how has the threat from Russia affected your relationship with the Nordics in security cooperation, for example, NORDEFCO? Are you more dependent on those kind of security relationships now that the threat from Russia seems to be getting closer?
Well, we have tried to perceive it in a way where we don't still believe, and that's an honest opinion and analysis, that we don't still believe that Russia is a military threat to Finland right now. That would be the case, I'd probably not be here but at home. But Russia has of course shown a pattern of behavior that is very worrying and unacceptable. And that's something we have also very clearly stated in our communication towards Moscow, and that's something that the international community has been very clear with. And that's something we do need to take into account in our future defense planning. The Nordic defense cooperation has taken very positive steps forward over the past years. I had the pleasure myself to chair the Nordic defense community last year. Now actually Norway, where you're from, is chairing it this year. And this is a very good development where we see more and more common activities in various sectors. It's exercises, it's defense capability building, it's crisis management, international operations, etc., etc. So we see a very good development. There's a lot of potential that is not yet taken to its full potential, so we do need to do a lot more. And it's clear that everything that has happened over the past years will make, from a Finnish point of view, all of these defense cooperation communities, be it then NORDEFCO, European Union, or NATO partnership, more and more important for us. And that definitely goes also for the Nordic Defense Cooperation, where Finland has been one of the most active and actually initiating countries in many ways and respects. And we do, and we will definitely continue to do so. And the good thing is that, for instance, the NORDEFCO cooperation is not competing with the NATO cooperation, nor with the EU cooperation. It's more a complement where these are actually compatible with each other and complementing each other in a very natural and actually functional way.
I think that's a good point to finish on. I'm afraid we have run out of time.
Yes, I'm going to Scotland to follow the independence campaign with my family.
Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you very much.